wrote McNamara's Folly to tell the story of a very sad and tragic chapter in the Vietnam War. And hopefully it will contribute to the possibility that it will never happen again. Today, I'd like to give you an overview of what happened. For me, the story began one summer day in 1967 when I was sitting in the Armed Forces Induction Center in Nashville, Tennessee. At one point, a sergeant came out to talk to us and tell us that we were headed to Fort Benning, Georgia, to begin our Army training. It was at the height of the Vietnam War, and I had volunteered for service in the U.S. Army. The sergeant asked, "Is there anyone here who is a college graduate?" I raised my hand, and he motioned for me to follow him, and he led me down a hallway to where a young man was seated, and he informed me that the man was named Johnny Gupton, who was also being assigned to Fort Benning. And he told me, he said, "I want you to take charge of Gupton. Go with him every step of the way." He explained that Gupton could neither read nor write. And he said he's going to need help filling out paperwork when you get to Fort Benning. And then he said, "Make sure he doesn't get lost. He's one of McNamara's morons." I had never heard the term. And I was surprised that the sergeant would openly insult this man seated in front of him. Well, in a few weeks, I would learn that McNamara's morons was a term that many officers and sergeants used to refer to low IQ men who were taken into the armed forces under a special program devised by Robert McNamara, who was the Secretary of Defense. The sergeant left us for a while, and when he returned, he had a big envelope that was sealed, and inside it were my personnel records and Gupton's personnel records. And I was instructed to take the envelope, and when I got off the bus at Fort Benning, to give it to the sergeants. Well, Gupton and I traveled by plane and by bus to Georgia, and along the way I tried to make small talk with him. I asked him what state he was from. He didn't know. I found out later that he was from Tennessee. He lived in one of the isolated poverty pockets in the eastern part of the state in the Appalachian Mountains. He was very thin, emaciated, unhealthy looking. As we talked, or tried to talk, I was surprised that he knew nothing about the situation he was in. He didn't understand what basic training was all about. He didn't even know that America was at war. I tried to explain what was happening, but at the end I could tell that he was still in a fog. In basic training, he was virtually helpless. We had to make his bunk for him every morning because he could not make up his bunk to Army specifications. I had to tie his boots every morning until one trainee had the patience and took the time to teach him that skill. He had trouble with commands like left face and right face because he didn't know his left from his right. He had trouble marching. When the sergeant screamed at him, he was terrified and confused. On the rifle range, he was erratic and dangerous with his handling his rifle, and the sergeants feared that he would accidentally shoot himself or someone else. Finally, he was put on permanent KP. That means kitchen police. That's working in the kitchen all day, scrubbing and cleaning in the mess hall. By the way, for all the men at Fort Benning that I mentioned, I have changed their names to protect their privacy and also protect the privacy of their families. Well, why in the world was such a man inducted? Later, I found out the historical background. During the Vietnam War, the U.S. government used the military draft to fill the ranks of the armed forces whenever there was a shortage of volunteers. In 1966, the war in Vietnam began to heat up, and more men were needed. How could McNamara and Lyndon Johnson round up enough men to send to war? Now, there were thousands of volunteers, but there weren't enough volunteers to fill all the slots that were needed. Johnson and McNamara could have drafted college boys, but they didn't want to do that because it would anger middle-class voters. Likewise, they could have sent men from the National Guard and the reserves to Vietnam, but that too would have been politically unpopular. The Vietnam War was very unpopular with many young Americans, so large numbers of men avoided the draft in a variety of different ways by taking advantage of various exemptions. I'll give you a few examples. Parenthood would win an exemption, so some men got married and tried to have a child as quickly as possible. If you had a letter from a family doctor about some medical condition, you could get an exemption. Some men gained disqualifications by contriving to fail their pre-induction physical exams. For example, one young man in Michigan ate 3 large pizzas each night for 6 months, so that he gained a lot of weight, and when he went in for the physical exam, he exceeded the military's weight limit for his height. He was disqualified. Some men jabbed their arms with needles to pass themselves off as heroin addicts. Professional football players were virtually immune to being drafted. In 1966, out of 960 professional football players, the draft took only 2. The rest found refuge in the National Guard or reserves. McNamara and Johnson were desperate. How were they going to get the warm bodies they needed for the military? So they decided to induct men who had failed the mental test for entry into the armed forces. On October 1, 1966, McNamara launched his program, which was called Project 100,000, because he wanted to induct 100,000 low-aptitude men each year. Now, that's each year. The program was much larger than that, but 100,000 each year. And when he announced it, he puffed up his program with high-sounding rhetoric, saying that he would salvage these men, rehabilitate these men. He would raise their level of intelligence. Now imagine the situation. One day, a man is unqualified. He's unfit for military duty. But lo and behold, the next day, he is deemed qualified. Now he is fit for duty. By the end of the war, McNamara's program had taken 354,000 low-aptitude men into all branches of the armed forces. The Army got 71%, the Marine Corps got 10%, the Navy got 10%, and the Air Force got 9%. Among the troops, they were often known as McNamara's Morons, or the Moron Corps, or McNamara's Boys, or McNamara's 100,000. And by the way, you may notice that I talk only about men. During the Vietnam War, women were not subject to the draft, although I should point out that about 11,000 American women were in the military, most of them nurses, and they volunteered for service in Vietnam, along with thousands of civilian women who worked for the Red Cross and other agencies like that. During the war years, 67 American women died in Vietnam. Now, back to Fort Benning. Toward the end of basic, I suffered from heat exhaustion, and I was sent to a hospital for a while. And then I was sent to an outfit called Special Training Company, for rehabilitation. Special Training Company was filled with men who were unable to pass basic training. And it was there that I got to see firsthand what life was like for dozens of these Project 100,000 men. At Special Training Company, the men were supposed to pass a PT test. That was what they primarily worked on, pass the PT, the physical test, in order to graduate. But most of the men failed miserably because of their mental limitations. Let me just give you one example. One of the events on the physical test was called the grenade throw. You had a practice grenade. The explosives had been removed, so it was not dangerous in that sense. You had to throw the grenade 90 feet to a flat target spread out on the ground, and it looked just like a giant dartboard. It had a bullseye, and then it had the concentric circles around it. And the scoring was just like for darts. The closer you came to the bullseye, the more points you made. To simulate combat conditions, the Army required the men to kneel down on one knee. You had to have one knee on the ground because that's the way you would throw in combat if you're behind a barrier. And so the men had to get down on one knee, and in order to reach the target, what they should have done was to throw the grenade in a high arc, the way a center fielder would throw if he's throwing a baseball to home plate, a high arc. But the men couldn't understand that concept, and they would throw in a straight line, like a pitcher throwing a ball to a catcher. The sergeants tried to demonstrate and explain that you needed that high arc. The men just, they couldn't understand it. I would take some of them out in the evening and try to show them how to do it by giving them a little mind game. I would say, okay, imagine that there's a bird flying up there in the sky. Throw your grenade and try to hit that bird. It didn't work. They just couldn't understand that concept of throwing in a high arc. So they never even hit the target, much less the bullseye. The problem was their mental limitation, and the mental limitation was also seen when they went to the rifle range. Now, to qualify with an M14 rifle at that time, the military wanted to simulate combat conditions, so the test involved the trainee standing in front of a hillside, a brushy hillside, and there were pop-up targets at different places. And you never knew when the pop-up target would appear. You might be looking for a target and one pops up over here at 50 meters and it stays up only 5 seconds and then it goes down. Oh, wait, here's one at 75 meters. 5 seconds and then it goes down. Back there's one at 200 meters. Flips up for 5 seconds, then it goes down. The problem the men had was that they weren't quick-witted enough. They weren't quick in their thinking. And if they saw one like over here at 75, they raise their rifle and take aim and fire, but by then it was too late. Oh, wait, here's one at 100 meters over here. They'd have to shift, try to aim at it, and squeeze off a round before it went down. They weren't quick enough. They couldn't do it. So they flunked out on the rifle test, and obviously they were not well suited for firing a rifle in combat. So what happened to these men? Well, it's obvious they should have been sent home. They should have been discharged. In fact, many company commanders tried to get them discharged. They would write memos, call on the phone, try to get these guys to go home, get them out of the Army. But unfortunately, both the Army and the Marine Corps were facing severe manpower shortages in Vietnam, and they were reluctant to discharge anyone. So most of McNamara's boys went to Vietnam. Now remember, we're talking about 354,000 men in Project 100,000. Most of them went to Vietnam, and then half of them who were sent to Vietnam were assigned to combat units. And the death toll was appalling. Here's the number of men, Project 100,000 men, who were killed in Vietnam. 5,478. Let me say that again, 5,478. Their fatality rate was 3 times higher than the fatality rate for your average GI. We don't know how many were wounded. We don't know the number of the wounded, but it was estimated to be about 20,000 men wounded, and of course many of them were permanently disabled, including an estimated 500 amputees. Well, who were these men? The book has a lot of stories about these men. I want to read you one. Barry Romo and his nephew Robert ended up in Vietnam at the same time. Barry said, "I loved Robert like a brother. We grew up together." He was only 1 month younger. Barry served in Vietnam as an infantry platoon leader in 1967-68, and he saw a lot of combat, winning a Bronze Star for his courage on the battlefield. During his tour, he learned that Robert had been drafted and was being trained at Fort Lewis, Washington, to be an infantryman destined for Vietnam. Barry was alarmed because Robert was, quote, very slow and had failed the Army's mental test. But then along came Project 100,000, which lowered standards and made him draftable. A host of people, his relatives, his comrades at Fort Lewis, his sergeants, his officers, wrote to the commanding general at Fort Lewis asking that Robert not be sent into combat because, as one relative put it, he would die. But the general turned down the request. Once in Vietnam, Robert was sent to an infantry unit near the border of North Vietnam, one of the most dangerous combat areas. During a patrol, he was shot in the neck while trying to help a wounded friend. He did not die instantly, but heavy gunfire kept a medic from reaching him. Barry said he drowned in his own blood. At the request of the family, Barry was given permission to leave Vietnam and accompany Robert's body home to Rialto, California. The aluminum coffin was sealed and draped with a flag, and the family was not allowed to view the remains. It was Army policy to discourage or forbid viewing when a body was badly mutilated. Looking back, Barry said that Robert really didn't have much luck. While others were getting deferments, he was drafted. While congressmen's sons were getting exemptions for braces on their teeth, Robert was drafted as part of Project 100,000. In a speech delivered 42 years later, Barry Romo said that the family had never recovered from losing Robert. His death almost destroyed us with anger and sorrow. Some people think that you don't have to be very bright to be successful in combat. That's not true. Men who were slow in their thinking were very vulnerable. To survive in combat, you had to be smart and you had to think quickly. You had to know how to use your rifle effectively and keep it clean and operable. You had to know how to navigate through jungles and rice paddies without alerting the enemy. And you had to know how to communicate and cooperate with other members of your team. A Pentagon official, Elliot Cohen, said, "The dull-witted soldier does not simply get himself killed, he causes the death of others as well." And here is what one Vietnam veteran said. His name is Chief Warrant Officer William S. Tuttle. If you take someone with an IQ of 40 and give him a rifle, he's more dangerous to you than he is to the enemy. I almost got shot twice and had one guy almost nail me with a light anti-armor weapon when he was startled by a sudden noise. If you put a low IQ man in an infantry patrol, you have to spend most of your time making sure he doesn't kill a comrade by accident and doesn't get himself killed during contact because he's totally unaware of what's going on around him. Imagine sending a 5-year-old into combat. That's what Project 100,000 was all about. Another veteran, Army veteran named G.J. Lau, served with the 1st Infantry Division in 1969. And he remembered a man that he called Jerry, didn't use his real name, he called him Jerry, who he said was a member of McNamara's 100,000. Here's what Lau said. One night, Jerry was out on the perimeter standing night guard. A very popular officer had been out setting his men in position and was returning to inside the wire. There is a challenge procedure, just like you see in the movies. Halt, who goes there? Lieutenant so-and-so. Advance and be recognized. That's not it exactly, but you get the idea. You order the person to halt and then do whatever it takes to identify them as a friend or a foe. Normally not a difficult task given the obvious differences between the average Vietnamese and us Americans. But for some reason, Jerry saw the officer approaching and shouted out, "Halt," and then immediately opened fire, killing him on the spot. The killing caused consternation in the camp. The men under the officer's command immediately made it known to any and all that Jerry was a dead man. Period. End of discussion. Someone must have taken that threat seriously because Jerry was gone at first light. Never saw him again. My book does not contain 100% grim, sad stories. There were some positive stories. I tell about some officers and sergeants and comrades who were sensitive and compassionate towards low IQ men. They are the heroes of my book. Some of the officers and sergeants protected low IQ men by keeping them out of combat and giving them relatively safe jobs away from danger. The man I told you about at the very beginning that I went into basic training with, Johnny Gupton, he was sent to Vietnam and he survived because he was protected by a sergeant. The sergeant gave him non-dangerous jobs away from combat. The sergeant sympathized with Gupton because he, the sergeant, had grown up with a sister whom he called mentally handicapped. Now I'd like to discuss Robert McNamara. One historian said that during the Vietnam War, among career military people, Robert McNamara was the most hated man in America. And I quote one officer in my book who said that because of Project 100,000, quote, Robert McNamara deserves to burn in hell. Many people wonder, what was McNamara thinking? How could he be so cruel? Well, here's the background. McNamara was a lover of technology. Like many Americans in the 1960s, he was dazzled by this exciting new world of computers and high technology. And he thought he could win the Vietnam War by using advanced technology and computerized analyses. When he launched Project 100,000, he promised that the armed forces would raise the IQ level of the men. He said that although the men may have failed in school, they wouldn't fail now because the military was the world's greatest educator of skilled manpower, and it possessed an impressive array of state-of-the-art multimedia equipment. He believed, this is no joke, he believed that he could raise the intelligence of low-ability men through the use of videotapes. He said, this is a direct quote from one of his speeches. A low-aptitude student can use videotapes as an aid to his formal instruction and end up by becoming as proficient as a high-aptitude student. Well, this idea was considered laughable and naive and ridiculous by many educators and psychologists. Well, yes, of course, video can be a wonderful, useful aid in instruction. It can help students to learn. But it's not a magical medium that can raise a person's IQ by 20 points. Deborah Shapley, a biographer who wrote a detailed book about McNamara, said that in regard to Project 100,000, McNamara was, quote, a naive believer in technological miracles. Well, how did things turn out? Were his videotapes capable of producing miracles? We'll never know, because very few men in Project 100,000 actually received video instruction. There was a war going on, and thousands of American fighting men were being killed or severely wounded. Army and Marine platoons in Vietnam were desperate for replacements. Training centers were under great pressure to get troops to Vietnam as quickly as possible. After the war, did McNamara ever express regret over Project 100,000? Deborah Shapley says that to the very end of his life, and he lived a long time, he lived to 93. She said that to the very end of his life, he refused to apologize or admit an error. She said he bitterly resented the term McNamara's moron corps, which he had heard for years. And he steadfastly believed that the program was beneficial to individual men and to society in general. What was going on? Well, he obviously was ignoring the many accounts of suffering and death, and he was just looking at the success stories about some Project 100,000 men who did well in the service. Yes, you heard me right. Some Project 100,000 men did indeed do well. And to be fair, I created a chapter called Success Stories. Let me read you an example of a success story. Chief Hospital Corpsman Don Phelps of Oxnard, California, who was in charge of a large sick bay on a Navy ship, recalled an assistant named Elmer, who was assigned to him over his objections. Phelps wanted his sick bay to be immaculately clean so that it would outshine and outshow any and all spaces aboard. He didn't want to take on Elmer as an assistant because he was one of McNamara's boys and he had no schooling and no chance of a responsible job in later life. Furthermore, he was not too bright, and he had to be taught the concepts of clean and sterile. But Phelps was ordered to take Elmer, and he was immediately surprised by the young man's solid performance and eagerness to please. Elmer made the sick bay sparkle with cleanliness. Phelps said, "I couldn't have asked for a cleaner, sharper space if I had a crew of 5 men working for me." Phelps said that because of Elmer's mental limitations, he never gave him any large amount of detailed work. But in the basic cleaning jobs that he assigned, Elmer took extreme pride in what he did accomplish. He was very polite and developed a highly commendable appearance. By tackling the dirty work and doing it exceptionally well, Elmer relieved hard-pressed lab, X-ray, and operating room techs to perform their functions more efficiently. He was vastly superior to the assistants of normal intelligence that Phelps had worked with, men who were sloppy and had a bad attitude. The story of Elmer supports the argument made by many educators and psychologists that low-aptitude individuals can be productive in low-stress, non-dangerous situations. Now, this is an important point. Low-aptitude men and women are not worthless people. They are not subhumans. They are capable of contributing to their families and to our society. In the workplace, they are capable of being successful workers if they are placed in low-stress situations with sympathetic supervisors and sympathetic co-workers. They need to be in a cozy haven, a protected place, a place that is far different from the military environment where sergeants are screaming at you and your fellow soldiers are rough and rowdy and the demands of daily life are extremely stressful. So yes, Elmer and some other Project 100,000 men did experience success in the armed forces, but they were in a minority. Most of the men of Project 100,000 suffered, and some of them suffered enormously. And you may be thinking, Project 100,000 was so terrible, surely we will never make this mistake again, right? Well, I have good news and bad news. The good news, in the early 1970s, the military draft was ended, thank goodness, and Project 100,000 was abolished, thank goodness. No more drafting of low IQ troops. But now the bad news. In the years since the draft ended, leading up to the present day, the Army and the Marine Corps have monthly recruiting quotas. And if they fail to meet their quotas, they are authorized to enlist recruits of low intelligence. The Army and the Marine Corps have tried to avoid taking these individuals. They don't really want them. But sometimes they've had to induct them in order to fill the ranks. The final chapter of my book is entitled "The Folly Continues." I give examples of low-aptitude men who have been inducted in recent years, especially in the war in Iraq, and some of them lost their lives. Let me share one example. During the war in Iraq, the military had trouble getting enough men and women to fill the ranks, so it lowered mental standards, just as it had done in Vietnam. In 2008, an Army private named David Dietrich of Perry County, Pennsylvania, was the subject of a Newsweek magazine article entitled, "He Never Should Have Gone to Iraq." Before and during his Army time, he was considered slow in his thinking, and he had trouble retaining information. In basic training, he couldn't hit targets on the rifle range, even though he was given extra training. One superior campaigned to have Dietrich sent home on grounds that he would pose a danger to himself and others if he were sent to Iraq. Started to say Vietnam. It's so much like Vietnam. He would pose a danger to himself and others if he was sent to Iraq. But the request was turned down by the Pentagon because there was a big push to get troops into the combat zone. As soon as he arrived in Iraq, he was assigned to act as a scout in an abandoned building where he was supposed to watch furtively from open windows. A few minutes after he started his duty at one of the windows, he was shot and killed instantly. A few days ago, I learned something else about this poor guy. I learned that other soldiers in his outfit had called him by his nickname. His nickname was Forrest Gump. It was Vietnam all over again. Now, in fairness, I should emphasize that the practice of accepting mentally limited soldiers and Marines today is nowhere near as widespread as it was during the Vietnam War. But the folly does continue. I would like to close my remarks today by answering this question. What can we learn from McNamara's Folly? For me, the overriding lesson is that low IQ men should never be used in a war zone or in a dangerous area. Putting their lives at risk is cruel, it's immoral, and on a sheer practical level, it degrades the effectiveness of war efforts. It was wrong to use these men in Vietnam, and it is wrong to use these men in the military today. I firmly believe that the armed forces need and deserve the best and the brightest. Thank you.